Greetings. I welcome you back to the third lecture in the Pandemics in History series with Professor Michael Rossi. Today, the topic is the influenza pandemic of 1918. You have just been listening to L'Histoire du Soldat, which was written during the First World War by Igor Stravinsky. It was supposed to premiere in Switzerland in September of that year. Of 1918, but the production had to be canceled because too many members of the orchestra fell ill with the flu. Then so did Stravinsky himself. The piece was not premiered until 6 years later, in 1924. My name is Emily Lynn Osborne, and I am the interim dean of the Graham School of Continuing Professional and Liberal Studies. I am also an associate professor in the Department of History here at the University of Chicago. I would like to pause today and reflect upon the present political situation here in the United States. Michael Rossi, our speaker, Zoe Eisenman, Graham's Director of Academics, as well as several others, and myself carried out a serious discussion about whether or not to proceed with the lecture this evening. As we well know, this past week has been dominated by the widespread protests that have emerged in response to the murder of George Floyd and of those of Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery. This flood of protests is informed by the memory of other African Americans before them who have died at the hands of police officers: Philando Castile, Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, and there are more. We recognize that in face of these fatal injustices and the structures and people who produce them, that words are not enough, that platitudes of values and principles ring hollow. We recognize that seriously combating racism and inequity requires serious material commitments, as well as profound transformations of our political and social and educational structures. Perhaps we should be out marching. Perhaps we should be spending our time and our intellectual energy pressing politicians, leaders, policies, and practices into new and more equitable forms. And so why, in light of all the work that does need to be done, should we take time this evening to study a historic event from over a century ago? What we have learned from our previous lectures is that pandemics are not simply biological processes. They are also political forces, and they are social forces. That our political system today is fracturing in the midst of COVID-19, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, is not a coincidence. Nor is the disease the sole driver or principal cause of the present strife, as we all know. But the pandemic has played an important role. Disease, as we have learned, has the capacity to both reveal and to exacerbate social and political divides. Disease can likewise illuminate and inspire xenophobia, racism, classism, homophobia, and widespread fear of difference in humans of all kinds. Indeed, the cries for justice that we hear today are also shaped by the painful knowledge that racism and bias do not simply contour policing and judicial systems. They also contribute to rates of life expectancy, the incidence of diseases, and the workings of our healthcare system. Evidence of these disparities can be seen in the mortality rates of COVID-19, which have disproportionately affected Black and Brown peoples in the United States. It is our hope that by delving into the past and learning from the influenza pandemic of 1918, that we may see ourselves there, and that through that shock of recognition, we may learn lessons from that era that may, in fact, help us to understand ourselves and to do better in the present. Our speaker, Michael Rossi, is an assistant professor of science and medicine in the Department of History here at the University of Chicago. As of July 1, he will be an associate professor, for he earned tenure this past academic year. Michael teaches classes such as History of Perception and Lab, Field, and Clinic, which consider the relationship of physiology, graphic representation, and linguistics. His book, The Republic of Color, Science, Perception, and the Making of Modern America, is an intellectual history of color theory. Professor Rossi's most recent publication, Visualizing Viruses, came out in the April 23rd issue of the London Review of Books. Before we turn the podium over to Michael, we will hear a few words from Zoe Eisenman, our Director of Academics, who will talk about the workings of this webinar. Zoe?
Thank you, Emily. Good evening, and thank you for joining our presentation today. We are recording this presentation so that we can post it online for people to watch at a later date. This is a webinar presentation, so you will be unable to unmute your microphones, and your video will not appear on the screen. You will also not be able to use the chat function, but we do encourage you to participate by considering the questions that Professor Rossi poses. You can post your responses in the question and answer box at any time during the lecture. You'll find the button to open the question and answer box at the bottom of your Zoom window. You can also use the Q&A to ask questions, which I or Emily will relay to the speaker. Due to the number of participants, we are unable to have individuals ask their own questions. Thank you very much again. And now to turn it over to Professor Rossi.
Great. Thank you, Emily and Zoe, and thanks to everyone who provided support in making this video. Thank you all as well for watching, and thank you especially for Emily for that introduction. I think it's important to reiterate that we are holding this session in a time of deep unrest, deep uncertainty, and profound hurt. And of course, we did indeed consider canceling the session in solidarity with those who are protesting police violence. But yeah, I want to emphasize that we ultimately decided to continue with the session, not least of all because of our hope through all of these lectures, and I think through our teaching more broadly, that history can provide some perspective on the present and a means of thinking about the future. Not a guide to the future, but a set of considerations to keep close at hand and close to heart as we navigate what I hope turns out to be a painful but productive moment of self-examination. And again, just to sort of emphasize this point, we've been suggesting for the past few sessions that disease is not simply a matter of pathogens or therapies, right? Not simply a matter of medicine as a technical skill, right? So the thing to keep in mind is that disease is political and none more so than epidemic disease. So I'm reminded here of the words of the physician and social reformer Rudolf Virchow, who's speaking in the middle to end of the 19th century. And I'll paraphrase him, but he said something to the effect of, actually I'm following him pretty closely here, epidemics are attributes of society. They point towards deficiencies produced by the structure of state or society. Epidemics resemble great warning signs, suggesting that the nation has been disturbed to a point which even a careless policy may no longer ignore. And so we will see aspects of what he meant by this today when we examine pandemic influenza. But I think it is also helpful to keep this in mind as we think about our own pandemics, our own social disruptions, and our own policies. So before we begin, I would just like to offer, again, a word of caution for this session and for subsequent ones. We will sometimes be dealing with vivid and possibly disturbing images and descriptions. Again, I want to emphasize that they're necessary for our purposes because they represent people's efforts to make sense of sickness and suffering, but sometimes they may be unsuitable depending on your disposition or those around you. Second of all, I'd like to reiterate what Emily said what Zoe said about our question and answer sessions. We will take questions throughout the, you can use your Q&A function to ask questions throughout the lecture, and we'll answer them at different points. And then we will discuss the readings afterwards, following from these questions, which were posted in the introduction, but I'll let you look at them here for a moment. And finally, I'd also like to add that there will be a list of the images used in the presentation in a sort of bibliography form after the lecture, and we will also post this online along with a recording of the video. So with that, let's begin our discussion of modern medicine in the time of pandemic influenza. And I'd like to start our discussion with a look at the news of the day, so ripped from the headlines, as it were. So it begins with reports of a disease spreading in the United States. We hear that churches are being required to curtail their services, even as new cases of the disease grow. We see state boards of health closing theaters and other forms of entertainment. We see the disease spreading. Africa, Australia, and South America start to report cases of disease. The disease shows unchecked progress around the world. Masks are recommended. Nurses are called to combat the epidemic. A demand for a vaccine grows. The epidemic closes even baseball season, prospectively. And then some signs of hope. We see a slight drop in epidemic deaths, some celebration, a recognition of volunteer work, and still a warning against the early lifting of restrictions. The peak is not yet reached, says the health board. So these are, as I said, headlines about the pandemic, but as you may have gathered, they're not headlines about the COVID-19 pandemic of 2019 to 2020. Rather, they were headlines from 1918 through 1919, taken from newspapers in the United States, England, and India, and they describe the worst years of pandemic influenza, or Spanish flu. Between its emergence in early 1918 and its decline in 1920, pandemic influenza swept around the world in 3 waves, infecting about 1/3 of the world's population. This is about 500 million people, and killing anywhere from 17 to 100 million people. With the 2 previous diseases we've been discussing, cholera and plague, we entered a world very foreign to us, one where disease was a matter of air and stars, where bodies were governed by occult processes, where official responses to disease were fractured and fast changing, and where terror ruled in the face of previously unknown sources of human suffering. In contrast, the 1918 influenza pandemic presents us with scenes of disease and reactions to disease that are relatively familiar. We see, for instance, medical institutions consulting with governments, giving advice and making rules. We see patients trusting, even demanding care from institutional medicine and from their allies in political authority. And we see modes of recording, photographs, newspapers, journals, statistical indices that reveal disease in ways that are congruent with our own modes of understanding. So today I want to sit with this familiarity for a bit, to examine its implications for how different societies, increasingly unified by one concept of medicine, dealt with mass disease on a previously unseen scale. Specifically, I want to look at 3 facets of the 1918 pandemic influenza. First, I want to think about influenza in terms of information. What was known about influenza? How it was known? How is that information made useful, comprehensible, and understandable? Second, I want to think about it in terms of organization, to look at the sorts of institutions and avenues that could generate, accept, and act upon information about influenza. Finally, I want to look at some of the ramifications of the ways in which influenza moved through these systems, particularly political ramifications, but also scientific ones. The goal here, of course, is not to suggest that nothing has changed, but rather, as Emily suggested, to look for aspects of that which is unfamiliar within the familiar, to pick out some of that which is uncanny, which seems almost correct but not quite. The twists on our own aspects of systematic knowledge that at once deepen our own understandings and make us aware of the limits of our own knowledge and knowledge-making techniques. So let us start with information and what was known and unknown about pandemic influenza. So one thing was clear by the fall of 1918. Against the backdrop of a world war that was tearing up Europe and reshaping political alliances around the globe, a terrible new form of influenza had taken hold. In North America, in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, medical journals, doctors' notes, and the occasional popular newspaper reported patients with a collection of alarming symptoms. The disease began as ordinary, if exceedingly vicious flu. There was a quick onset of aching, sore throat, fever. It was severe, but nothing to worry too much about, because flu was known as an inconvenient disease, but not usually a killer. Indeed, a somewhat morbid medical joke of the period held that influenza was a doctor's friend. It made people sick enough to need care, but not so sick that they were likely to die. As the disease progressed, however, the patient's condition could go beyond that of normal flu. Patients in the state would often display mahogany spots on their cheeks, these characteristic blush marks, and doctors learned to read them. If they were bright red or sort of brick red, that was a good prognosis. The patient would likely live. If the spots began to turn a bluish color, that meant sure death. As time went on, opportunistic pneumonia frequently set in. Patients' lungs filled with fluid. They struggled to breathe. They began to spit out frothy blood. Their lips and extremities took on a darkened or bluish appearance. Doctors reported a characteristic crackling sound from the lungs, which were being pulverized by the disease. Patients began to smell like musty straw in some reports. Some patients hemorrhaged from their eyes, nose, intestines. Others sprained limbs from coughing. Up to 1/3 of the patients died, having drowned in their own fluids. After performing autopsies on the flu's victims, physicians often likened the damage done to that of the poison gas used in trench warfare in the First World War. So extensive was the destruction of lung tissue. And this is for those physicians out there, this is a section of lung taken from an influenza victim around 1918 and preserved. Nor were symptoms limited to patients' bodies. Profound psychological trauma appeared to be a hallmark of the disease. Patients would become restless, agitated, afflicted with deep insomnia. Some raved and had to be restrained. Many became suicidal, sometimes successfully. And here we see an impressionistic depiction of the combined physical and mental toll of the disease in a painting by Edvard Munch, the author as well of the well-known painting, The Scream. This one is entitled Self-Portrait with Spanish Flu from 1919. So this is his expression of what it felt like having Spanish flu. So again, a psychologically profoundly distressing disease, but also those who survived frequently had lasting psychological sequelae. So things like disorientation, memory loss, confusion, depression for years thereafter. And here again, we see another portrait by Munch, this time after he recovered from the Spanish flu. This is his painting entitled Self-Portrait After Spanish Flu. And so this gives us sort of a before and after look at these sort of psychological impacts of the flu. What's more, it quickly became apparent that the flu was not only violent, but also perverse. So ordinarily, a flu's mortality curve would have a U shape, something that looks like this, meaning that if you plotted it against sort of death rate against age, you would expect to see very, very young people being hardest hit and the very elderly being hardest hit, with the least affected being sort of young adults. The pandemic influenza of 1918, however, hit young, strong, healthy people with disproportionate strength, yielding this what's often described as a W-shaped curve. Pregnant women in particular were especially susceptible to the new influenza, as recorded by the artist Egon Schiele, who painted this picture entitled Family in 1918, shortly after his wife, shown here, and their unborn child both succumbed to influenza. He also painted this shortly before he himself, in fact, died of influenza as well. So again, not only a violent disease, but violent in unexpected and long-lasting ways. The source of this misery was widely known among medical specialists of 1918 to be a bacteria. It's this bacteria here called Haemophilia influenzae, or Pfeiffer's bacillus, named after its discoverer, Richard Pfeiffer, a student of Robert Koch and a famous bacteriologist in his own right. Now, it was not totally clear why the bacteria, which ordinarily was supposed to cause regular influenza, which is to say, very unpleasant but seldom lethal influenza. It was not totally clear why the bacteria had suddenly become deadly. The isolation of a flu virus would not come for another 15 years, although some people did speculate that perhaps Pfeiffer's bacillus was not the culprit, but some unknown entity like a virus. And we can talk more about what a virus was, perhaps in Q&A. Whatever its medical identity, however, popular blame for the flu tended to be fixed not on the bacillus or even on social conditions which enabled its spread, but tended to fix on people, sort of particular groups. And we've seen aspects of this previously in previous plagues, previous epidemics. So the disease, as I think we all know, was widely known, at least outside of Spain, as the quote unquote Spanish flu, because the earliest public reports of its arrival came from Spain. Now, this does not, I should say, reflect an epidemiological fact, but a political fact insofar as Spain remained neutral in the war and therefore had fewer press restrictions than belligerent nations like Britain, the US, and Germany that had suppressed news of the disease. So Moreover, it should be said that should one choose to see more nefarious origins for the flu, for the influenza, its ubiquity made it possible to pin on other groups as well. And so here we see, for instance, an article from the Richmond Times-Dispatch dated October 6, 1918, in which the Times-Dispatch reports its discovery that the Spanish influenza did not come from Spain, but came from Germany, and from the German trenches in particular. And in fact, this article does not say so, but some accounts of the period actually hold it that flu was a German, what we would now call a bioweapon of sorts, so that Germany had been deliberately spreading this extraordinarily virulent strain of flu. Again, there's no historical evidence to suggest this is the case. Or just to give another example, as we see here, the idea that influenza came from China, based as it were on an analogy between plague and influenza, is also a not infrequent trope or idea. So this particular article is from the San Francisco Chronicle, again from 1918, and it draws a sort of an analogy between the deadliness of the influenza epidemic and the deadliness of the plague bacillus, which was still present in China as recently as 1910. We might also note, well, the conviction that, we can't really see it here because it's likely too small for you to read, but this caption professes the conviction that the disease was the fault of the quote unquote, well, I'll quote him directly here, quote, beggar class of Manchurian who lives in a condition of frightful uncleanliness and facilitates the spread of every epidemic. And so again, we see the sort of blame laying that on marginalized members of society that has characterized previous pandemics as well. I think this would be a good time perhaps to take a few questions before we move on. So, Zoe, if you can.
Yeah, I have one for you. This is a rather complicated one. Karen Morgan says, I recently read that there was a strong spike in infection among people born in 1890, the time of the Russian flu. There is a hypothesis that antibodies those people developed to that flu confused the body's responses in 1918. Any comment?
That's one theory that I have not run across. I mean, there is confusing idea. I mean, again, not being a medical doctor, I don't want to profess to too profound an understanding of this, but my understanding is that the fatality of the flu, particularly among sort of young adults, was due to sort of an immune response, like the body's immune system sort of, I guess to put it in lay terms, sort of went into overdrive, and the body sort of smothers itself. But it's called I believe it's called a cytokine storm, if I'm not mistaken. But as far as whether that is triggered by the 1890 epidemic, that's unclear. One also reads the sort of inverse, which is that people who had lived through the 1890 epidemic, were just slightly older than the people who were getting hardest hit, and that's why they were more immune. So I think I don't know if there's any actual sort of consensus among biological historians, as it were, as to what the particulars were.
I have a question from Heidi Rockwell and Jane Hudson, who ask similar questions, which is, why is the range of death estimates from the influenza pandemic so wide? Why don't we have a more precise number about the death, the fatalities, rate of fatalities?
Right. So mainly because depending on just because we'll talk a little bit about this shortly, but mainly because depending on location, there may or may not be good records for people may or may not be keeping good records. So for instance, China is a case in point where my understanding is that the sort of reported morbidity, so reported people who were both infected and reported deaths is rather low because of because of political instability, which lowers counts, which gives China seemingly an impossibly low count. One sees the same thing with Russia in the same period. In places like the U.S., we have pretty good and pretty granular data. for exactly the reasons that we'll start to talk about, in fact, presently. I mean, mainly because this follows from our discussion of cholera. So in response to things like epidemic cholera, we start to see the creation of these public health infrastructures, right? So really sort of solid lines for reporting on, for reporting different diseases. In fact, we get the concept of the reportable disease at this point, which is also one reason why it's a little bit hard to figure out the sort of the path of influenza, because influenza is not usually a reportable disease. So in this period, reportable disease is something like yellow fever or smallpox. That's something that a doctor is obliged to tell authorities about. Influenza is not, it's only influenza. It's just, it's not something to be overly concerned about until about the spring of 1918. One more.
I just want to note that Linda Labanowski also came in with that same question. So it's very good that we addressed it. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. All right, so let's continue. All right, so thinking about infrastructure, we can turn to this question again of organization. All right, so we've established that Spanish flu wasn't Spanish and or wasn't Spanish in origin. But then one question we might ask is, where did it come from? How did it spread? And what could be done about it? And these will involve precisely these questions of not only sort of collecting information, but acting upon information that we've sort of been, that we have been working with just now. All right, so, first of all, I should emphasize that nobody knows for sure, and the subject is hotly debated. However, there's strong circumstantial evidence that the 1918 pandemic first emerged in the United States several months before it emerged in Spain. The location of this emergence was the American Midwest, not so far from Chicago, as it turns out, in Kansas. So there what we see is an unusually aggressive strain of influenza beginning to be reported at Camp Funston. This is a sprawling military facility that you're seeing here, designed to train and house roughly 40,000 to 50,000 men who are destined to go fight in Europe. As a precaution, incoming men would receive inoculations against common epidemic diseases like smallpox when they entered the camp. But influenza, again, wasn't something to worry about until on March 4th, a cook reported ill in the morning. By the end of the day, 30 more recruits had reported sick. By the middle of the month, more than 1,000 men at Camp Funston were sick. 30 of these men died. The camp doctor had to requisition space in a hangar as an emergency hospital to make room for the sick. And so this is the emergency hospital that you can see here, crowded with beds. Still other recruits, numbering in the tens of thousands, went about the normal course of their work, shipping off to other army camps in the US and then to Europe. The army camps that they visited had outbreaks of influenza. The populated areas around the camps had outbreaks of influenza. By June of 1918, influenza was running rampant all over the world, in Asia, in South America, and on both sides of the Western Front, or sort of in Europe, wreaking havoc on war planning. By the end of the summer, it had followed the lines of troop movements and commercial traffic around the world. By October of that year, a second far worse wave of influenza began to appear simultaneously in different spots around the globe. So in Sierra Leone, in Boston, in the United States, in Brest, France. Now this one was more severe, severe enough and widespread enough to break press censorship on both sides of the Atlantic, and indeed to break press censorship around the world. So for instance, in the US, and again, we have good figures for this, in the US, more than 1.5 million people became sick, and 675,000 died. In Europe, 2.5 million people died, which was about 1.1% of the population. In India, 15 million people died, or about 6% of the population. It's 13.8 million of whom did so under direct British rule. So this becomes important for the political fallout of the pandemic influenza. In what is now Iran, was particularly hard hit as well. Somewhere around 1.5 million people, the figure is disputed, succumbed to the disease with extremely high mortality in rural populations especially. And in Africa, in the entire continent, we see roughly, again, the number is, there's a wide range of number, but you can sort of means out at about 2.5 million people who died from influenza. And again, the point here is that we can track this progress, as we were saying before, in part because in different parts of the world, national and colonial public health officials set up networks to monitor the disease. So here we see a telegraph from Nairobi to Mombasa requesting statistics as to death from influenza. Right? So the idea here is that people are interested in collating deaths from around territories and indeed from around the world. All right, so what is to be done about pandemic influenza? Well, again, we're going to see things that remind us very much of our own contemporary medical practices, but it is worth saying that while by 1918, the world had largely accepted biomedicine, excuse me, not the world, but certainly the sort of ruling elites of the world had largely accepted biomedicine, some remnants of old beliefs still persisted. So here, for instance, we see 2 British amulets used to ward off disease, and particularly in the case of the black cat, danger from war. Nevertheless, with these sort of charms aside, the new form of medicine that we touched on last time, medicine based on sciences like chemistry, biology, physiology, statistics, this new form of medicine had achieved some stunning therapeutic and technological developments. So take, for instance, surgery, where everything from the physiology of pain to the spread of microbes could be controlled through new technological interventions, technologies like anesthesia, for instance, and technologies like antiseptic and aseptic techniques within the operating room. Or we might consider aspirin and other antipyretics. These are synthetic compounds that could reduce fever and diminish pain. So here we see an advertisement from the 1890s for aspirin. Again, it's a new painkiller made by Bayer. You might also note heroin down here, also the brand name for a cough medicine, a sedative cough medicine. We might think about how these sorts of technological innovations yield different varieties of epidemics somewhat further down the road. We also see things like antibody therapies. So it becomes possible to derive serums, not vaccinations, but serums from animals to produce cures for diseases like diphtheria. And actually on the subject of vaccines, we also see the development of vaccines. As we saw last time, we saw vaccines for cholera, we see vaccines for rabies, anthrax, and so forth. Based in no small part on these and other interventions, one finds in the face of influenza, at least initially, a great deal of confidence in the possibility of medical intervention. So serums, antitoxins, based on Pfeiffer's bacillus, for instance, could be and were injected both as prophylactic measures and as cures for influenza. And so here we see a soldier getting a shot of influenza serum in the arm. And the idea here is that you would sort of infect an animal with Pfeiffer's bacillus or diphtheria or whatever, usually something big like a horse. Then you collect its blood and distill a serum from the blood, which will contain antibodies, and then you could inject that into a person and stimulate the person's immune system. Needless to say, these were of limited efficacy because, as we now know, but there were debates in the period about how effective they were. We also see a widespread use of disinfectants, again, sort of technologies derived, not least of all from the operating room. So this is a disinfectant spray being administered in the mouth of a recruit. And the idea is that you simply want to disinfect the mouth and nose area to kill the Pfeiffer's bacillus before it gets into the respiratory system. This is a military version. This is a disinfectant spray being used on civilians in New Zealand, I believe. At times, the American military had its recruits gargling with salt water in the absence of a supply of disinfectants. So this seemed as good an idea as any. The point of all this is that all these interventions have in common the idea that they are based in the theory of germs that we discussed last time, that is elucidated and expanded upon by modern laboratory sciences. Right? So rather than having the sort of disparate origins that we've seen, or sort of disparate etiologies that we've seen for the past 2 sessions, now we're starting to see convergence on sort of one idea of what disease is, and one idea really with many variations on how to handle it. Let's see. We also see the enforcement of mask wearing in public. And this, of course, is a measure derived from surgeries, but carried outside the surgical theater. So whereas it was possible to create an aseptic space inside a surgical theater, the idea is that one can sort of try at least to replicate, if not asepsis, then some sort of antiseptic procedure outside the surgical theater. And here, this is a shot, photograph of a train conductor in Seattle, who, as you can see, is wearing a mask. And he is telling this man who's not wearing a mask that he will not be allowed to board the streetcar, streetcar, not a train, excuse me. He will not be allowed to board the streetcar if he does not wear a mask, right? And again, there are many, many sort of instances of mask wearing to near ubiquity in the period of 1918 to 1919. So we see, again, masks worn in barber shops. Here, a postal worker, I believe this is in New York, wearing a mask. Here, office workers wearing masks. And again, there are countless other examples of this. So outside of medical technologies, again, based in hospital and lab practice, we also see efforts to control, again, people's behaviors. And this is not so dissimilar from what we started to see towards the end of our discussion on cholera. So for instance, we see efforts to curtail public spitting, for instance. So this sign tells you, first of all, it tells you prominently not to spit, right? It's because spitting spreads Spanish influenza. But we might note the link between sort of personal conduct, public health, and the national project of prosecuting war, right here. We also see what I think of as a variant on the idea of social distancing emerging in this period. So in this case, in climates that would sustain such behavior, we see instances of people holding sort of public events, like things like court and classes, outside whenever possible. So this is court being held outside in, I believe this is San Francisco. And in this case, again, this is not social distancing in the sense of limiting the concentration of people, because clearly you can see people are packed together. But the idea here is to limit the concentration of potential bacterial exposure in the air that they were breathing. So, so this is a sort of variation on that theme, sort of social distancing, but turned inside out, as it were. Finally, we also see the widespread use of quarantine, though with variable successes. So there are, by 1918, there's a fairly good reporting system, and we do see boats with people who are stricken with influenza being quarantined as they come into different ports, and their sick passengers being rushed to hospitals and kept in isolation. Of course, this has variable success because we now know, and it was even speculated at the time, that by the time people were showing symptoms of influenza, they were possibly not contagious, and well before they showed symptoms, they were contagious. In any case, we do see some successful instances of quarantine. Australia is one notable case of a very successful quarantine. So Australian officials took the reports of influenza quite seriously, and the sort of continent largely avoided the second wave of pandemic influenza by imposing a strict quarantine on its ports. It only lifted the quarantine in 1919, which was too soon as it happened. And so that winter, influenza finally struck Australia, but it was a milder strain. And so another case we might look at is the cases of American Samoa and Western Samoa for still another instructive example. So American Samoa in 1918, shown in this picture, was administered by the United States, by the US Navy, and as per policy went under strict quarantine in 1918, a quarantine that was not lifted until 1920. As a result, I have found no cases reported of Spanish influenza. Western Samoa, on the other hand, with the upheaval of war, had passed from German possession to New Zealand's administration. It was not held under quarantine and suffered terribly, some 20% mortality, mainly among indigenous Samoans. Quarantine was therefore effective when practiced to its utmost, but that was a difficult task in the best of times. And so again, we see this global spread of deadly influenza in spite of most of the best efforts of contemporary medicine. In the end, the most effective treatment came in the form of another rather unsung aspect of modern medical organizing, modern medical organization, and that is to say nursing. So professional nursing, I should say, is another development of the late 19th century. It is a form of labor that is indispensable to the functioning of biomedicine, the functioning of large medical organizations like, in particular, hospitals, but also colonial administrations. And professional nurses both cared for influenza patients in disproportionate numbers and died as well in disproportionate numbers from influenza, while they did things like keeping patients comfortable, keeping them hydrated, administering aspirin, which actually turned out to be a fairly effective therapy, at least for keeping patients in comfort until the disease ran its course, which seemed ultimately, finally, like the best that medicine could do. So let's take some more questions. That's all I have to say about that.
Okay. We have a question from Elizabeth. She asks, was there actual testing for the Spanish flu, or was it based on symptoms?
Well, so this is a good question. So you can, yes, you can test, especially pathologically, you can test for Pfeiffer's bacillus. And so this was one of the, so Pfeiffer's bacillus is fairly common in the respiratory tracts of people. And so it turned up in many influenza cases, both Spanish influenza and otherwise, which is why it was supposed to be the primary agent. It did not turn up in all cases, which violated Koch's postulates, which we talked about last time. This idea that you should be able to find an infectious organism in all cases, but then again, Koch violated Koch's postulates too on occasion. But there was nothing like an antibody test that we might have today for COVID-19. So mainly symptomatic, but also on the level of laboratory practice and trying to figure out sort of medical measures for to be taken against pandemic influenza. Yeah, that's where you would see things like laboratory testing.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Mrinalini Kata Rao asked a question about did the flu affect men and women differently? And I would like to take that question as a launching pad for you to ask you a bit more broadly about, in the US or elsewhere, was there a different among different ethnic racial groups about the flu, how it was treated, and thinking again today about racial disparities with COVID-19.
Thank you. Yeah, so the short answer is that yes, it absolutely was. Well, there's an interesting thing going on here actually, because as we look over the slides, of course, one might wonder, right? Because most of the people that we're seeing in these pictures most of the patients are male and most are white, and yet this does not at all reflect the actual sort of global composition of victims of the pandemic. So again, non-European people of non-European descent, and people outside of Europe and North America did suffer disproportionately. Particularly indigenous populations were particularly hard hit. So in places like Tahiti, 1/7 of the population died from pandemic influenza. In Kenya, it was something like 1/4 of the population. In North America, we see nearly 25% of indigenous people living on reservations caught the flu, and mortality was something like 9%. And so again, because we have good figures on this, we can say that 9% mortality from the flu, first of all, is incredibly high to begin with, but it's 4 times higher than in other populations. We see some similar things in New Zealand. Maori people sometimes experience up to 25% mortality. And again, the sort of granular detail that we get shows us that in the US, African-American people, soldiers anyway, so the people who were being tested would be, or who were being sort of most closely observed would be, among African-American people would be male and soldiers. But African-American soldiers experienced a much higher mortality in spite of a much lower morbidity. So the figures seem to suggest that fewer African-American people got sick from pandemic influenza, but those who did were more likely to die. Again, this comes from structural inequalities in the administration of care and sort of and healthful practices and healthful conditions. And so then there's also this interesting question that, just to follow this up, this question of, I guess as I'm thinking about this question of representation in sort of in the photographs, right? So it's a complicated question since we have photographs now, so we have perhaps an expectation that whereas our previous sources were drawn from paintings and caricature, right, when we were discussing plague and cholera, now there is an expectation of reporting, right? So there's some sort of much more, there's an expectation, I suppose, of what we might crudely call objectivity. And yet, so I don't have the field, I should say, I could ask you about this, Emily, as well, because I don't have the field specialization to speak about archives outside the United States. But at least one does see that, at least in US archives, the subjects of the photographs are overwhelmingly white, right? It's overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly male. And it's very hard to attribute this to anything but disinterest on the part of official photographers in representing and reporting on non-white people's experience of disease, right? So another way of saying this is that the sort of the normal or standard patient is automatically the white patient, which to your and to your sort of pre-interlocutor's question, that I think is a way that things like disease disparities and illness disparities sort of get swept away, right? And they are seen to be non-problems because they are literally unseen. Yeah. Did you have something to add about the? I was going to ask you about the. You're muted.
Oh, there we are. Sorry about that.
I
don't know a tremendous. I work in West Africa, and I don't know a tremendous amount of. I haven't spent a great deal of time studying on the influenza and its toll there. I mean, I would tend to agree with you generally about how the default patient in photographs and the concern and the colonial state's preoccupation when there were health crises was, of course, the colonial apparatus itself and its members and its higher up members, which would have been in the part of the world where I do work, French officials, and elsewhere in Kenya and whatnot, British ones. So that insight definitely resonates through the colonial world, but I would hesitate to go much beyond that at this point. But I'll take it up.
Yeah, I mean, yes, it's one of those questions that is difficult to answer other than anecdotally, but anecdotally, I think we might be seeing similar kinds of phenomena. All right, shall we move? Well, I guess this brings us sort of to the question of the repercussions of the 1918 influenza pandemic. And I want to again emphasize or sort of echo something that Emily said before, which is that I want to emphasize that, first of all, what we're looking at here, we're not looking for monocausal explanations for history, right? So we're not looking to say, I don't believe I can say this about anything really, but that pandemic influenza caused sort of worldwide changes itself. But rather what we're going to see is that pandemic influenza exacerbated conditions that were already extant, right? And sort of where invisibilities, where once conditions had been either invisible or understated, sort of pandemic influenza, as COVID-19 is doing today, made visible these gaps that were otherwise, again, concealed in things like official records, as we've been seeing, for instance, in photographs. All right, so yes, let us talk a little bit about the repercussions of the 1918 influenza. Well, so first thing to know, by 1920, the flu had largely burned itself out. So there was a third wave following the second wave, but again, it was milder than the terrible second wave. Japan was one of the last places to be affected by its third wave. So here we see school children in Tokyo wearing masks to guard against influenza, and this would be around 1920. And again, in its wake, in the wake of the flu, we see, as we said before, we see a death toll of anywhere from about 1% to 2.7% of the world's population. Again, depending on whose estimate one uses, and these estimates are often sort of calculated not based on sort of concrete figures, but based on a combination of concrete figures from various authorities and then extrapolated to areas for which we have no figures. All this to say, the numbers of people not only killed but displaced by the flu are staggering. So one number, like estimates of people orphaned by the flu in Africa alone are in the range of 10 to 20 million people. We see Economies obviously suffered. We see crop failures, resulting famines. They're not uncommon sequelae, social sequelae of the flu. In politics, it is often said, the flu left its mark on negotiations between belligerents following the First World War. The American President Woodrow Wilson had come down with the flu in 1919 in the midst of debates between the Allies about the nature of peace settlements that would be reached by warring nations. So Wilson, sort of shown here, insisted on a less punitive stance towards Germany. Britain and France, represented by Clemenceau here and Lloyd George here, insisted on the opposite and insisted on a more punitive stance towards Germany. So on April 3rd, 1919, Wilson was struck with the flu. His physician thought he would die because the attack was so severe. He lived, but came back to negotiations 5 days later, a changed man. He was peculiar, in the words of one of his aides, unable to focus, irritable, and resigned. In the end, he gave up fighting for a less punishing peace, and the lopsided Versailles Treaty was signed, paving the way for the Second World War. And again, I'm repeating this argument not to suggest that the flu was the only cause for Wilson's capitulation, or that history would have unfolded differently. But I want to convey that certainly to observers at the time, observers who were present at the time, Wilson's failure to argue for a more suitable peace was the result of his bout with flu. And so again, I bring this up because one hears frequently that the flu was sort of the cause of World War II. I don't think it's that, but it is based on people's recollections at the time of this sort of mystifying behavior following the bout of flu. In other parts of the world, the flu had much more direct effects. So in South Africa, for instance, the flu spawned public health measures that were unusually centralized for the ordinarily decentralized Union. The Public Health Act of 1919 was passed in direct response to the 1918 pandemic, and it ensured sort of health and public health measures and disease prevention for all citizens, by which, of course, it was not explicitly mentioned, but they meant all whites. The act referred to all white citizens. This act, among other things, enabled the removal and resettlement of poor white people from public slums and into more healthful surroundings. And again, the fact that these measures only applied to white people was never specifically stated, was only assumed. But these measures, this sort of this de facto segregation, helped to cement the sort of segregation that would be passed into law in 1948. So again, there's a direct way in which public health infrastructure, we see the ways in which pandemic reinforces public health infrastructures that themselves reinforce existing political fault lines. In British-controlled Nigeria, the severity of the flu was considered by many to represent not just a failure of the colonial government, but a result of direct discrimination against Africans. So again, officially, this is another case where records are not great. Officially, almost 3% of the population is recorded as having succumbed to the virus, although certainly the count is much greater. Women were especially hard hit, not simply in terms of the virus itself, but in terms of its secondary impacts. So when men couldn't work because of influenza, women had to take over their tasks as well. A situation which created both simmering resentment and some historians argue a political awakening that contributed to the so-called Women's War of 1929. This is a series of anti-colonial protests violently suppressed against economic and political inequalities that was led by Nigerian women. Let's see. Influenza, likewise, is often credited to contributing to political instability in British-ruled India. Again, this is in the words of sort of participants at the time. The famines and differential disease outcomes from the influenza sparked civil unrest and cemented the authority of Mahatma Gandhi's Congress Party. And the heavy-handed response by the British colonial administration to the civil unrest further undermined the administration's authority and solidified opposition. So again, we're running short on time, so I'll just say that in the 20th century, then, we see that pandemic disease renders social inequalities and medical inequalities indistinguishable. And again, we continue to see that to this day in ways that we'll pick up on next week. The last thing I want to say is simply that finally, it's not related particularly to politics, but more directly still, the flu had a singular historical impact on medical therapeutics. This was when, in 1928, a young researcher was working on the problem of Pfeiffer's bacillus, which remember was still thought to have caused the flu, and was hoping to understand the cause of the terrible mortality of the epidemic. The researcher had sloppy bench technique and left his petri dishes of Pfeiffer's bacillus out over the weekend. When he came back, he was disappointed to discover that a mold had started growing in the dishes and was killing some of the bacteria. Although he didn't think much of it at the time, the researcher, named, as you might have guessed, Alexander Fleming, noted the result, and 10 years later, some entirely different set of researchers from Oxford University used this accident to develop penicillin, the first of a revolutionary strain of antibiotics. So these novel drugs within the next 30 years would make contagious disease seem like it would be eventually, by the late 20th century, or by the early 21st century, late 20th century, contagious disease would seem like a thing of the past. These drugs would pave the way for a new medical optimism, fueled with a sense of what government could and should do for its people. And it is this combination of optimism, joined with the sense that citizens had a right to live maximally free of ill health and contagious disease, that will set the stage for our next and final pandemic. This is the HIV/AIDS pandemic of the 1980s through the present. And so let's end there and take a couple more questions and maybe discuss some of the readings.
Okay, well, we have a lot of questions. I wanted to start with, there's a whole set of questions asking about President Wilson's role in the pandemic in the US. So relating to his censorship, to how was the federal government's response to the pandemic, especially given that this was, there were so many military personnel affected. And did the president lead the US with health recommendations, quarantines, event closures, and things like that?
Yes. So short answer is no, something we might also be familiar with. So the response from Wilson himself was sort of deafening silence, as it were. So of course he is well known for having muscled through a series of extremely repressive sort of anti-sedition measures, right? So including the idea that even the distributing anything, I believe he enabled the Postmaster General, if I'm not mistaken, to censor any mail that could be construed as harming the war effort or influencing morale. And so something like an influenza pandemic would indeed hurt morale. And so so there was extremely little. So at least initially, it was extremely the very notion of the flu was tamped down by sort of official channels. There were also. Where to start with federal response? In terms of military, I mean, I guess I can just give you that. In terms of the military response was also conflicted. So one of the sort of hallmarks of the sort of movement of troops at this time was close quarters and sort of people stuffed into, more people than should be stuffed into spaces, being stuffed into spaces. This was recognized fairly early by medical officials in the Army, but they did very little to stop it. Or they were able to do very little to stop it, even over their objections. And this is at a very high level as well. As far as leadership goes, the leadership mainly came from sort of municipal and to lesser degree state officials. So you see. And again, we see examples of woeful responses. So, if Philadelphia is a particularly notoriously bad example of how not to handle a pandemic, including things that may again seem very familiar today, like parades that were that should have been canceled that were not canceled for political reasons, right? So the idea of and again it was sort of a boss system. So the idea of extremely weak public health infrastructure interacting with sort of autocratic rulers yields. Is a recipe for spread of pandemics. I'm trying to keep it short, but I can go on and on. Yes, there's countless examples of failure, but also many examples of at least the sort of attempts at envisioning what a functional response would have been like.
Okay, great. Well, how about Emily, you have one?
Yeah, I have one. Sandra Jackson Apoku wants to know about the role of the yellow peril. So the idea, the rhetoric in the United States about the existential threat that people of Asia and Asian descent, supposedly threatened Western civilizations. And if disease played a role in that, if specifically the influenza pandemic or disease more generally, I think we could also think about one way that you can think about this, which you've talked about a bit, but how did the influenza pandemic figure into international politics and the diplomatic relations and other relations? I mean, there is a world war going on.
Right.
If you could speak to the political effects internationally, globally.
Well, yeah. So I mean, I guess. All right. So
two parts.
Yeah. So the two-parter. Let's take them in order. As far as these sort of the so-called the question of yellow peril, yes, disease definitely played a part in that, right? So there's this idea. And there's many good books on this. If one is interested, there's a book by Nyan Shah, I believe called Contagious Divides, although my memory's not serving me lately, which is about San Francisco's Chinatown, basically from about if I'm not mistaken, from the 1890s through the 1940s. But the short answer is that like oftentimes immigrants, particularly Chinese immigrants, were seen as unclean and reservoirs of disease, right? And were targeted specifically as either for having communities quarantined or for sort of police persecution on the grounds of public health, things like this. So yeah, but again, this is not for pandemic influenza particularly. This would have been for a variety of disease, like not least of all, things like like things like STIs, for instance. Like the idea of both moral and physical corruption coming from these communities was something that was not at all uncommon. As far as the sort of World War components of Spanish influenza, one sees actually more. What do you think about this? I feel like I'm uncomfortable around saying one sees more instances of the 1918 flu being linked to some sort of rhetorical notion of German aggression than a yellow peril particularly, and so it's not racialized in quite this terms. Although as we saw again, it could very well be because of its assonance with plague and plague's recurrence in China. I'm not a military historian, so there may be military historians in the audience who would know this better than I. It seems to me that from sort of peripheral to the medical literature, there is an argument as to whether pandemic influenza forestalled, particularly forestalled a German victory or forestalled German movement across the Western Front. Apparently, there were several sort of planned attacks that failed because there were too many soldiers with influenza. Again, I don't have the expertise to evaluate that. Certainly, again, I can say though that certainly it was felt by commanders on both sides that the influenza was ruining their war efforts, and so that's again a sort of a sort of less cerebral political consequence of pandemic influenza. And then again, as I said before, there are I listed three sorts of instances where two really colonial instances where the very variable with the noticeable differential in morbidity and mortality between colonized people and their colonizers led to civil unrest and sort of I would say again, it didn't seed, but it didn't seed sort of anti-colonial movements, but it certainly was an element that fed these movements. So I'd say that would be a sort of a high level answer, but.
I have a couple questions that relate to sort of social impact and reaction of populations in the U.S. Marcio Pinto, had asked, how favorably did the population, especially in the U.S., react to the restrictions being imposed, such as masks, quarantine, etc.? And then related to that, Megan had asked, do you have any information about the social impact of infection control efforts during this time? It seems that with many people struggling with disruption in their daily lives, it would be good to know how people got through it before. Thinking of relationships, dating, marriages, not being able to go to restaurants, etc., canceling large events. convincing people to wear masks, although I recognize modern life is quite different than 1918, 1920, so maybe lessons don't apply very easily. So those are sort of a two-part question there.
So let me see. Keep trying. So the question is both how did people react to the measures and how did it affect their lives?
Yes.
All right. So to the first part, one sees in some ways one sees many, at least sort of in individual encounters, one sees many sorts of familiar occurrences, right? So we see, I don't know, I found newspaper articles about, someone getting angry at a police officer for telling them to put their mask on, or people getting into fights at stores because someone's wearing a mask and someone else isn't, right? And so we see sort of like low-level things like this, which strike us as familiar. I'm also thinking of a real, I should say I'm from Philadelphia, so I say this with love, Philadelphians, but it's sort of what I thought of as a characteristic Philadelphia moment. Philadelphians seem really upset about sports events being canceled. So we see a lot of that sort of, again, in papers. As far as, but in general, one doesn't read about, and I'm not sure if this is because it doesn't exist or because it's not being reported on, one doesn't read about a great deal of sort of, we don't have people showing up at city halls or at state houses, demanding reopening, right? And indeed, there is there are debates. I don't know if reopening would be the right word, right? So we don't have like sort of lockdowns like we have today, right? We have sort of selective ramping downs of various things. So schools are sometimes closed, but sometimes not, because if you are, again, one idea is that perhaps if your school has a lot of immigrant children, they might be better off at school than at home, where they're crushed into squalid quarters, right? This is the words of health inspectors. So again, so the assumption that it doesn't look exactly right, exactly like our own system is correct. And there's also not as much in the way of social safety as we have today, small though that is. As far as, that's a good question about things like dating, I don't know. Again, there's lots of sort of jokes about kissing with masks and how kissing with masks is okay, and like you can still do that, and like and I guess there's some slogan in New York like "better ridiculous than dead" about wearing masks. So I guess that signals a little bit of sort of humiliation. But yeah, I don't know much about that. As I mentioned, the problem of what to do with orphans from Spanish influenza was huge. Again, I don't know that we see the same sort of thing today. So yeah, so I guess some similarities, not a lot of clues though as to like how actually, so how to really reopen, because I don't think the similarities are close enough in that sense. Yeah.
Hi. So I have a question, and then I think we should talk about the readings.
Let's do that.
But I did want to put this one out there from Demetra Kasimis, and I hope I pronounced that correctly, but I probably didn't, about gender and nursing. And, it is very striking when you think about the previous lectures that we've had, that medical professionals have up till now really been men, unless I'm misremembering. But this lecture has photographs of women as nurses. And of course, what comes to mind is Florence Nightingale and her treating British soldiers during the Crimean War. But when you think about the history of women of course, women have been healthcare givers since time immemorial. Let's make that clear, right? But this sort of professional medicalization of healthcare, you start to see, where does World War I and women, how does that work? And the influenza pandemic figure into that?
Yeah, so so what you said just now about women being caregivers for time immemorial, it precisely feeds into that. Yeah, so prior to the short capsule history would be like, so prior to the 1880s or so, or the 1890s, you would see like, so much nursing was mainly handled by female family members, right? If again, because, okay, so first of all, before 1880, we don't have a strong system of hospitals, or at least hospitals are not a place that you want to go if you're sick, right? You go to a hospital if you have nowhere else to go, and then no one who cares about you, and you're likely to die there. And so if you are going to be cared for, it'll usually be by a female family member, right? And so we see this actually. I think Louisa May Alcott, for instance, complains about this, right? So she says, in some of her letters, she says that even after she had sort of achieved a measure of fame as a writer, she was still being, when a family member would get sick, she would still be called, and she would have to heed the call to nurse them, right? So this is the sort of this gendered component from time immemorial that then gets sort of turned into a legitimate form of labor, again, through the need to staff. This is a very short and crude way of putting it, but for the need to staff these new institutions that start really emerging in the 1880s, sort of the hospital, right? The hospital full of, not just full of sick people who are sort of going there to be, to sort of convalesce, right? But people who are going there to be treated, right? And so you need people to sort of help run the hospital, and that's what fell to nurses. And Florence Nightingale, in her notes on nursing, makes it clear that nursing is a sort of a disciplined, almost mechanical practice, right? You have to learn how to move your body in space, and you have to comport yourself in a certain way, and it's a job best done by people with the sensibilities of women. And so that's the short answer is that it's a traditional, I guess, a traditional practice that gets turned into a professional practice.
Should we discuss the readings? I'm sure our audience members now, I will say, as you were pulling up the readings, there was someone who asked, and I don't know if I can find it right away, who asked for a list of articles and books for the next lecture.
Oh, cool.
So please, you can, yes, it was Alicia Smith who has said, next week, can you give us a book and article list? So.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and I can.
There's an interest in
marvelous.
There's interest in more reading, and I will note that the reading that we gave this week that we'll start to talk about.
Let me do this.
We included the whole Willa Cather book as after chapter 5. So I'm wondering if anyone continued onwards. But you offered us two very different readings, a very short, brief article in the Lancet, and then the Willa Cather. We were only supposed to read chapters 5 and 6, but it was possible to read more if we wanted. Why don't we start with the Lancet article?
Okay, well, it's not coming up for some reason, but there we go. Okay, the Lancet article. Okay, so now I'm going to do this. I'll just start screen sharing. Okay.
Is it coming? There it is.
We're seeing that okay?
Yeah. Yeah, there it is.
There we go. Hopefully that works. Yes, so.
So what, I guess one initial question, which you allude to in your openings about the readings, but why did you pick this article for us to read?
Well, one because it's sort of this, one because it is sort of this, it is interesting to see the first moment, right? So it is on the one hand an origin moment. On the other hand, because I wanted us to sort of sit with and think about the way that the sickness was described, right? Especially like if you think about, so like we have sort of this is a first turn. I believe this is a first for us, like, which is a turn towards numeracy, right? So like trying to keep track of things like pulse rates and temperatures, for which, of course, for things like temperature, you need a machine like a thermometer, right? Which is relatively, say, 1880s vintage in medical practice anyway. Yeah, so, and again, also, I wanted to, it was interesting to me anyway, that one gets a sense of, through all of the objectivity, one gets a sense also of urgency, right? So I guess one thing that I wanted to convey with both of these readings is that I think I phrased the questions earlier in the lecture as a distinction between literature and science, but this is actually an art. I mean, I personally feel this is sort of an artificial distinction.
You know what else struck me about it? Both of these readings, actually, the sense that medicalized knowledge about the body, about the physiology, about all those things is more particular and more sophisticated, and yet the treatments don't seem to have kept up with that. That it seems like they can note and they know a lot about it, but they still are not able to combat it very effectively.
That's true. And that's something you actually see like from the 1830s on up right until about the period that we're reading about now. And, maybe, you start to see a great deal of, and physicians say this at the time, see a great deal of knowledge about the body, and yet still little that can be done. And again, so still things like nursing and things like public health interventions are still the main things that you can do for people. Again, there's exceptions like diphtheria antitoxin that's efficacious, and various vaccinations. But yes, but I'll stop there just to say that again, even these interventions, even interventions like vaccinations and antitoxins, still seem still seem statistically less significant than things like public health and sanitation interventions. Which again, you don't need to take anyone's temperature particularly to.
So here we have an observation by Wilkes, who writes, regarding the readings, the letter to the Lancet by Collier included more medical jargon, of course. In contrast, Willa Cather focuses more on what the layperson witnesses to the disease we are seeing. The death of Tannhauser was especially vivid. It's interesting because only medical personnel ever see people suffering COVID-19.
That is true.
Although actually I would argue with that. That seems to be the sort of dominant narrative, but in fact there are people who choose to stay at home. I heard a whole story about immigrants to this country who don't have proper papers, many of whom choose not to go to the hospital. Some of whom, I wouldn't want to put a proportion or percentage upon that, but there are real concerns about hospital treatment.
But certainly the point is the point is sound, that the anticipated sort of the anticipated working of the system is that you would suffer COVID-19 again in a medical surrounding, whereas that was by no means the case in the time of pandemic influenza. I mean, even to be in as institutional a surrounding as a Navy vessel would still be uncommon, right? Often you'd be around family members or who themselves would certainly either be infected or themselves sick. So,
should we talk a little about the Willa Cather reading?
Yeah, I was just saying, two different types of.
It's about a boat, but it also transports the reader. I mean, it is.
Wow, that's good.
As Wilkes put it, very vivid.
Yes.
And the other thing that struck me is there were a number of readings from last week about cholera that focused on ships, transmission on ships. And here we have an actual case study of that. Well, not of anyway. So why did you pick Cather?
Mainly for exactly what you said, for the vividness, for the sense of again, for the sense that writing to give a sort of multidimensionality to writing about disease. Again, worth thinking about the things that Cather picks out in the ways that she describes versus the things that Collier picks out to describe. Whatever, again, the same sort of clinical entity, but we might also ask whether they are very different, whether their different experiences make them, in fact, compatible or fundamentally incompatible. I think it's an interesting question to mull over. What are we seeing in terms of comments?
It also brings life to the spike that you talk about in that graph about young men, also young, fit men.
Right.
Yeah, also bringing it.
Big Tan.
Zachary Leffel writes that Willa Cather's novels seem to focus on the different reactions people have to the outbreak, whether it's isolation, compassion, fear, or dignity. These themes are often seen in other times of distress. Do you think the pandemic's response reveals truths about society similar to those revealed by other adversities?
What was the last part?
Big questions.
What,
Do
does it
you think
reveal?
the pandemic's response reveals truths about society similar to those revealed by other adversities? Or do pandemics provide unique insight into a society's weaknesses and strengths? He wrote triumphs and flaws.
I guess, I mean, maybe this is my own disciplinary, I guess I can answer the question just pretty directly, but based on my own sort of disciplinary preconceptions. I mean, I do think that there is something about the, again, particularly in this era, like not all the time, right? But particularly in the era that we're talking about, which again has its resonances with our own eras, in which pandemics reveal, they reveal expectations, right? Like things like they reveal the ways in which, people, again, one doesn't want to lump all people into the category of people, but as in people as a monolithic category is what I mean. But but it does reveal the ways in which sort of common assumptions about how the world ought to be can be foiled, right? In ways that I think, I don't know. I suppose I'm spitballing a little bit here, but I would think that things like war or something, earthquakes are in some ways less susceptible to that, right? Because they're both because disease is both common. Disease is common, but pandemics are uncommon, I guess is one way of saying it.
Candace wonders if maybe sometimes people don't take COVID as seriously as they should because they don't know people personally who have had it or have died from it, and that the statistics are abstract and distant. And that Willa, in a sense, I mean, Willa Cather's book brings people who are suffering from the flu, from influenza to life, and makes them very real to us, and that there's power in that. I'm elaborating a bit, but that is her point.
Yeah, I wonder.
That is Candace's point.
Right. I've thought about this a lot actually, because particularly the COVID point, because while we may sort of have COVID-19 sort of visually distanced from us, we do have a lot of we do have many accounts. In some ways, I think actually, and the variability of accounts of COVID-19 are greatly exceed, for instance, accounts of the 1918 pandemic. Right? There's much more readily available, more textured accounts of the inequalities and inequities that the disease is revealing, and of different experiences, right? Like, as you were just saying, right, the experience that not everybody goes to the hospital, like we anticipate that people should, but some people are sort of dissuaded to, again, by the very system that is telling them to go to the hospital, right? So, or not, maybe not forcefully enough. So yeah, I wonder. I guess this is a parallel to the question about, and this is something it's an interesting question that I can't answer empirically about whether, about how sort of the 1918 pandemic affected everyday life. Clearly people were, the question of how seriously did people take it is a good one. I guess we assume pretty seriously, but I guess I don't have a ton of evidence to suggest that that's actually true.
Zoe, do you want to ask? We should probably move to closing up, and Michael, maybe you could pull up the slide to help people remember to register for the next lecture, which is next Wednesday at 6:30. We encourage you to register if you have not already done so. The other thing I'll say, Michael, is in addition to wanting lists of books and articles to read, we also have requests that the reading go up a little sooner. So we're going to work on getting the reading up a little bit sooner for you. We will work on doing that.
I did see that.
Zoe, did you have one last question you want to give to Michael?
Well, let's see. I was trying to find a good sort of concluding one, but I think you have talked about most of the general topics that people have been asking about. It's interesting, a lot of people have mentioned family stories in the Q&A.
Really?
Yeah, and again, I'm sorry I haven't posted most of these, but they're I'll see if I can go through and put them up there now.
Thank you.
I don't really have an answer for them. I don't think we have an answer for them, but it's interesting to see how many people had either family stories or in one case, the absence of family stories. So maybe that's a good one to end on. We had a question. It seems like people forgot about this pandemic. You know, people said that they'd talked to their grandparents or other family members about things that happened in the early part of the 20th century, and nobody mentions the flu. Do you think that there's a reason for that, or that there's, you know, that's a typical experience?
Gosh, a reason for that. Yeah, I don't think I'd be equipped to answer that. What would a reason be that people would? I don't know. I guess that would get into that would sort of be a philosophy of collective memory question, right? So, what are the reasons why people sort of collectively remember or memorialize things or not? You know, certainly, I guess certainly that's true in the United States, that it's forgotten. My understanding is that, for instance, Maori artists in New Zealand actually did make sort of monuments to the pandemic influenza, because it was, you know, not least of all because it was so the fatality rate was so great. So could depend on sort of what a community finds valuable to remember. It could. Yes, I'm not actually sure. I'm gonna say no. I don't think I'm philosophical. My philosophy of memory isn't sort of finely honed enough to really answer that well.
Well, and sometimes people remember things or actively try to forget things. So sometimes people don't remember things because it didn't have bearing, and sometimes people actively forget things because it's too painful. And so that can also be a factor.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the only other thing I would say is that perhaps it gets swept aside, you know, or perhaps it gets sort of sidetracked by memories of World War I as well, right? But again, I'm not actually sure that memory works that way, where we only have capacity to remember one sort of historical trauma at a time. Again,
but cultures can signal to us what are the important things to talk about and to articulate.
Well, yes, right. So I guess the sort of follow-on thought to that would be exactly that idea of, you know, hopefully for our own time, right? We're having numerous simultaneous upheavals, which are not coincidental, and so hopefully we will be able to learn and remember and grapple with all of these things at once, and not let certain elements fall by the wayside.
I should conclude because we are at 8 o'clock. I want to thank Zoe for being here as ever, Michael Rossi for giving his talk today, and the audience members. You've been wonderful and you asked terrific questions, and I'm sorry that we're not able to get to them all. But regardless, I hope that everyone has a healthy and safe and serious week, and that we will see you next Wednesday. So forge ahead, take care of yourselves, stay healthy and well. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Good night.
Good night.